Welcome back to Lecture 3, and this week we're going to talk about the origins of the novel Frankenstein, as well as the beginning few pages of that novel. The letters, they're not really chapters, they're fictional letters that have been written to kick off the main story. So, in the summer of the year 1816, Mary Godwin and her future husband Percy Shelley, along with Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont, who was having flirtations with Shelley at the same time, were still traipsing about Europe. If you remember where we left off our discussion last week, talking about how Mary and Percy eloped and sort of ran away while Mary was still young, that was still going on at this time. And they came to Geneva and rented a villa, or a summer house, on Lake Geneva, called the Villa Diodati. They shared the home and spent the summer vacationing with none other than Lord Byron, a fellow romantic poet, and Byron's friend, Dr. Polidori. Now, this was a beautiful country for people to spend their summer vacation in, especially for poets like Byron and Shelley, whose emotions were stirred by majestic natural settings. Keep in mind that they were both writers who were involved in the Romantic movement and what that movement valued in terms of sweeping emotions and natural vistas, things like that. So Lake Geneva was under the shadow of the Swiss Alps and Mount Blanc, which Shelley praised so highly in his poem to the mountain that I had you read last week. However, they ended up spending most of their time indoors. In Mary's own words, it proved to be a wet, ungenial summer. Heavy rains would keep them inside for days, and they would have to entertain themselves by either talking about recent news or telling stories. One night, Byron proposed to the group that they each write a ghost story. This is the sort of game that you might expect would arise from a gathering of famous writers. Perhaps feeling the need to prove herself an original thinker or an original writer, Mary set about coming up with a story in earnest, even after the others gave up on the game pretty shortly afterward. But no ideas came to her. Until apparently, one night, while they were all sitting around the fireplace, the discussion turned to the topic of modern science. They discussed things such as the origin of life and what made inanimate objects animate. Keep in mind that this was at a time when people were seeking for a scientific explanation to life. The idea was that such an explanation, such an origin, had to be found in the material world. It couldn't be found in the supernatural world. Apparently, at one point in the discussion, the idea was raised that if there was a material source of life, it could be given to a corpse and reanimate the corpse. There was a popular idea at the time that has come to be known as Galvanism. This was the idea that electricity was the source of life, because if an electric shock was applied to muscles of limbs of a corpse, it would cause them to move and jerk. This all ties in with what was known in the 19th century as the vitalist debate. Vitalism was the belief that living organisms were different from non-living organisms because they contained some non-physical, non-material element that acted as the spark of life, what we would call the soul. Galvanism was seen by those who opposed vitalism as a strictly material or physical cause of life. Percy Shelley's physician, a man named William Lawrence, actually had a famous series of debates with a surgeon named John Abernathy between the years 1814 and 1819, in which Lawrence took the materialist position. That is, that life was a mere assemblage of the functions that a human body could perform. That there was nothing spiritual in the cause of the vital spark of life. It was all cause and effect in the material world, and it was all verifiable by scientific observation. It was probably Percy's connection to Lawrence that raised the topic in the first place, and Percy and Byron were likely to have taken Lawrence's side, although we don't have the exact details of what their conversation that night was like. Now, as you can imagine, this isn't the sort of conversation that's conducive to a good night's sleep. Afterward, Mary went to bed, and she records in her journal that she had a nightmare, or a waking dream. In this dream, she saw a student scientist huddled over a corpse, and through some means causing it to stir to life. She records in her journal that it was frightful, and frightful because it was a human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. So from the beginning, from the very germ of the idea, Mary saw that this would be a story of transgression. It's about a man setting himself up in the Creator's position to grant life. But that was her dream, and when she woke up, she knew that she finally had a good story to tell. And that's the origin story of the novel that has come to be a classic, not only in literature, but in cinema as well, Frankenstein. Some stories take a while to take off. Some authors don't become household names until after they've already passed away, but Frankenstein was popular from just about the beginning. For a long while, people actually thought that Percy Shelley wrote the book. They were surprised to find out that such a macabre, gory sort of thing was written by a woman. They were also led into this belief because Shelley did have a hand in editing Mary's first edition of the book. He was already an established poet after all, and Mary adored him, as we talked about last week, so she was perfectly willing to make any changes to the manuscript that he suggested. The preface, which we'll talk about in a minute, was actually written entirely by Shelley, although I'm sure Mary had a hand in dictating what was said. Pretty soon after its publication, people had a lot to say about Victor Frankenstein and his monster. By the way, that's something that has grown to be kind of twisted in modern pop culture. The monster itself isn't named Frankenstein. The monster doesn't have a name. In the book, it's called either the creature or the demon. Frankenstein is the name of the scientist who made the monster. So now let's talk about the novel. I mentioned the preface earlier, written by Shelley, and it's interesting because it reads as a sort of justification for why such a novel should exist in the first place. It argues that the novelty of the situation, the science fiction aspects of it is what we would say today, afford an opportunity to explore aspects of human passion and human emotion that a realist novel covering ordinary everyday events wouldn't. The idea is that even though the events in the novel themselves are impossible or improbable, the way that the characters react to them is the way that we might speculate someone would naturally think or act in such an unprecedented situation. It's a hypothesis of human behavior being tested out in the realm of fiction. And I think it's a good justification not only for monster novels or gothic novels, but for most science fiction and fantasy novels as well. There are things to learn about ambition, loneliness, and pride in Frankenstein that are highlighted by the unrealistic events that happen in the novel. Just as there are things to learn about courage, hope, and friendship that are highlighted in books such as Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Even though the events are fantastic and in fact take place in a world that doesn't exist, those themes or those hypotheses about human behavior are realistic. Another thing that the preface does, and which the title page does as well, is situate the novel within the tradition of the Western canon. It harkens back to Shakespeare, to Homer's Iliad, and to the tragedies of the ancient Greek dramatists. The title page makes two allusions, one in the novel's subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, and the other in a quote from John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. Both allusions will be revisited throughout the novel. Prometheus was the Titan in Greek mythology who bestowed the gift of fire onto mankind in spite of the will of Zeus. This gift of fire in a play like Prometheus bound by the Greek tragedian Aeschylus was synonymous with life and culture. It enabled mankind to reason, to build, to discover the arts. And the quote from Paradise Lost is a part of Adam's lament after his and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden. That is what the Paradise Lost is about, if you don't know. We'll see in the novel that Victor Frankenstein fancies himself a modern-day Prometheus. He wants to give the gift of fire, the spark of life, to an inanimate creature. And we'll see Adam's lament echoed by the creature himself, when he challenges Frankenstein's justification for bestowing life on a whim, which is exactly what he's done. I just wanted to point these allusions out because it shows that Mary was looking back to works of art of the past as she was writing her novel. She was informed by history, and that is, again, why a class such as this one is valuable. So that if perhaps some of you decide that you want to write your own stories, or whatever, you can do it while being informed of these works that have come before you, and letting those works to some extent influence your own. So getting into the novel Frankenstein itself, we see that the first few pages are written in the form of letters from a man named Robert Walton to his sister who lives back in England. Now, many novels of the 18th and 19th century employed this device to create a sort of in-story justification for why the story exists in the first place. When we come to the novel Dracula, we'll see that the entire novel is written in this way, composed of letters, journal entries, and even newspaper clippings, all fictional, of course. The letters only last as long as Walton is our point of view character, however. Pretty soon after that, the novel shifts from Walton's perspective to Frankenstein's. And then the style changes. It becomes a story told from the first person. This novel is a great example of what is called a frame narrative. It's the literary technique of telling a story within a story. We begin with Walton's journey, which frames the setup for hearing Frankenstein's tale once he meets Frankenstein on his journey. And we even go one step further because embedded about halfway through Frankenstein's tale, we get another person's tale, that of the creatures. So they're stories within stories, kind of like in the movie Inception where there's dreams within dreams, if you've ever seen that movie. Other famous examples of frame narratives throughout history would be Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, where the setup is that there are all these different pilgrims from different diverse walks of life journeying to Canterbury, and then they each tell a tale that's unique and stands on its own because they get into a storytelling contest. We see this in John Milton's Paradise Lost as well, where the entire war in heaven is told in retrospect to Adam and Eve by the angel Raphael. The next novel we'll be reading in this class, Wuthering Heights, is also a frame narrative. We'll see how Emily Bronte employs this technique when we come to that novel. So we learn from these letters to his sister that Walton is on an expedition of discovery. He's in Russia and he's hiring a whaling ship to take him to the unexplored regions of the North Pole. One of the reasons for this voyage is that he hopes to discover the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, skirting the continent of North America. This was a favorite pet project for explorers in the 19th century, and even much earlier than that. The discovery of a quicker route to places like China and India overseas would have been a tremendous benefit to traders and merchants. But this goal, practical and useful though it would be, is secondary in Walton's mind. He's hoping to come across a greater discovery, or at least a discovery of more personal significance to him. We learn that he's grown up perusing his father's library, which is full of nothing but accounts of sailors and explorers. His imagination has been fired by these stories, even though his father is against him throwing his life away out on the seas and has tried to dissuade him from doing that. He's picked up from these accounts a sort of pseudo-scientific idea that really was prevalent at the time, that far, far north, if one could withstand the frozen ice cap surrounding it, lay an Edenic paradise that was untouched by decay or winter. The idea was that since the sun never sets entirely at the very top of the earth, there has to be some land of eternal summer, and this is the land that Walton is hoping to find. He wants to make a scientific discovery, a great breakthrough. Walton is definitely a man of the 19th century, as we talked about last week. He's seeking to map out the blank edges of the map, to bring things hidden and unknown within the realm of human understanding and human quantification. He values intelligence, a cultivated mind, as he calls it, and people who are seeking for glory. He wants to be a great discoverer, and he selects crewmen who have that same drive and those same wild dreams. But he also fits our definition of a romantic hero, or a Byronic hero, that we talked about last week. He tells his sister that he's exceedingly lonely, and that's why he's writing to her. There's no one on board the ship to talk to who can sympathize with him or converse with him. And there's a bit of smugness happening here as well. He sees his crewmen as not being cultivated enough to establish a real friendship with. They may be nice enough men, but they don't have sensibility. Now, sensibility in the 19th century was the ability to respond to and appreciate strong emotions or works of beauty or nature appropriately. For example, if you could look at something like Niagara Falls and not be stirred by the sight, not be moved, there was something wrong with you. You would have been considered a brute. Now, it was also possible to be too full of sensibility. Jane Austen's classic novel Sense and Sensibility shows us two sisters, one of whom has an abundance of sensibility and doesn't pay enough attention to the matters at hand. But overall, it was seen as a virtue to have, and Walton wants a companion who possesses it. Well, he gets his wish, but in an unexpected way. One day, as their ship is bound by ice caps, they see a monstrous-looking figure passing them on a sled being led by dogs. Then, a bit later, they see another sled approaching, and there's a haggard, freezing man leading it along. They bring him on board, but only after they assure him that they're heading north, in the direction where the first sled was also fleeing. This stranger, we'll later come to find, is Victor Frankenstein. And as the days pass and Frankenstein recovers his strength, he and Walton both come to discover that they have a lot in common. They're both ambitious for glory. They've both undertaken scientific quests of discovery, as we'll learn later, in Victor's case, and they're both a bit selfish. They've put others at risk to achieve their ends, and because of this, they're both isolated and cut off from ties with family and friends. It's why they're both so lonely. Maybe it's not clear at this point that Frankenstein has done any of this or that he feels this way, but after his story begins, it becomes evident that this is the case. And Frankenstein, seeing this similarity between the two, decides to tell his story to Walton as a sort of cautionary tale. He's not just telling his life story to make a conversation or to pass a pleasant evening. It actually pains him to tell it, he says, but he thinks that it might be helpful for Walton to hear. He gives his reasons why near the end of the fourth note. He says, "I had determined once that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you have won me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my misfortunes will be useful to you, yet, if you are inclined, listen to my tale." So he's setting up why he's telling this story to Walton. He says, look, we're both kind of starting out from a similar place, and I don't want you to end up like me. So the story is effectively framed for what follows. We have an ambitious young man, again on the outset of his great quest of discovery and fame, and a man whose own quest of discovery and fame has ended in ruin, loss, and despair. So, for next week, read the first few chapters of Frankenstein's story. Read chapters 1 through 4 of Volume 1. The book is divided into 3 volumes, even though in our day and age it's a rather short novel. And we'll pick up things from there next time.